The murmur of passengers blended with the rolling of suitcases and the distant airport announcements. Inside the first-class cabin, the air was still, filled with the faint scent of new leather and expensive perfume. Wealthy passengers were comfortably seated, some sipping wine, others flipping through glossy magazines. An elderly woman entered, poised yet unassuming. She wore a light blue shawl draped elegantly over her shoulders, her silver hair neatly pinned back. There was no rush in her steps, no urgency like the others. Every movement she made exuded calmness and quiet confidence. She gently placed her small leather handbag on the seat, smoothed out her dress, and gracefully sat down in seat 1B. Then came the sharp click of high heels against the cabin floor. "Excuse me, ma'am, but you can't sit here." The cold, detached voice came from a flight attendant standing behind her. Dressed in a perfectly pressed uniform, the woman stood tall, hands clasped in front of her, her face void of warmth. Her sharp eyes flicked over the elderly woman with a hint of skepticism. The woman looked up at the flight attendant, her expression serene, undisturbed. "This is my seat." The flight attendant frowned, glancing at the ticket in the woman's hand before offering a thin, practiced smile. "There seems to be a mistake. This seat is reserved for a certain type of passenger." Silence fell over the cabin. A few passengers glanced up from their magazines, their interest quietly piqued. Some exchanged subtle looks, listening in on the exchange. Yet, the elderly woman remained composed. She tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but firm. "And what type of passenger am I?" A shift in the air, something invisible yet heavy, settled over the space. For a fleeting second, the flight attendant's confidence wavered. But just as quickly, she regained her steely composure. No one on that flight knew that within minutes, lives would be forever changed. The cabin felt eerily still. The usual hum of quiet conversations died down, replaced by an almost palpable tension. The elderly woman sat with unwavering grace, her hands resting gently on the armrest. There was no sign of distress, no hesitation, only quiet strength. The flight attendant, Danielle Calloway, was not pleased. Her brow furrowed as she glanced at the ticket again, as if hoping to find a mistake. But there was none. Eloise Gardner. Seat 1B. Instead of admitting her error, Danielle exhaled sharply, lowering her voice in an attempt to reassert control. "Are you sure this is your ticket?" Eloise simply tilted her head. "Would you like to check it again?" The response was so calm yet cutting that a few nearby passengers turned their heads. A middle-aged man reading a newspaper raised an eyebrow, intrigued. A young woman bit her lip, clearly invested in what was unfolding. Danielle felt the weight of watching eyes. A small voice in her head urged her to let it go, but her pride wouldn't allow it. She forced a stiff smile. "It's just that we usually reserve these seats for certain distinguished passengers." Eloise blinked, her tone unchanged. "And I am not a distinguished passenger?" Danielle pressed her lips together, realizing she had just repeated her earlier mistake. Irritation crept in. Why was this woman making it so difficult? Out of the corner of her eye, she spotted Emily Reed, a younger flight attendant standing near the cockpit door. Emily had witnessed the entire exchange, her face laced with uncertainty. Danielle inhaled, trying to reassert her authority. "It appears there was a system error. I can arrange for you to be seated elsewhere." Eloise cut her off with a single, pointed question. "If there's a mistake, I would like to hear it from the captain." Silence. No one had expected this. No one thought an elderly woman would stand her ground so effortlessly, challenging a flight attendant with such quiet strength. And no one on that plane could have predicted that this was only the beginning. Danielle clenched her fists, her frustration barely concealed. She was used to giving orders, not explaining herself. But with passengers watching and a fellow flight attendant observing nearby, she had no choice but to nod stiffly. "Very well," she said, her voice dropping lower. "I'll call the captain." Turning on her heel, she strode toward the front of the cabin, the sharp click of her heels echoing off the floor. The moment she disappeared, Emily stepped closer to Eloise, concern evident in her voice. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Eloise gave her a small, knowing smile, one of quiet amusement rather than distress. She placed a gentle hand on her leather bag and said softly, "Young lady, I've been through far too much in life to be rattled by something like this." A shiver ran down Emily's spine. She had a feeling this wasn't over. And she was right. Danielle marched toward the front of the plane, her hands clenched at her sides as she tried to suppress the frustration bubbling up inside her. She had never been challenged like this before, especially not by an elderly woman. Reaching the flight intercom, she pressed the button, keeping her voice professional yet firm. "Captain Pierce, I need verification on a first-class seating issue. There seems to be a misunderstanding with a passenger." Silence. Danielle waited, impatience creeping into her posture. Then, finally, the captain's steady but sharp voice came through the speaker. "Passenger's name?" She glanced down at the seating chart, hesitating for just a moment before replying, "Eloise Gardner, seat 1B. Another pause, but this time, the silence felt different. A strange creeping unease ran down Danielle's spine, but she shook it off. And then, the voice that responded was no longer Captain Pierce's. A deep, commanding voice came through the intercom instead. "This is Charles Gardner. Would you like to repeat what you just said?" Danielle froze. That name. There was no way she misheard it. Her entire body turned cold, because everyone in the airline industry knew Charles Gardner. He wasn't just a VIP passenger. He wasn't just another wealthy businessman. He was the owner of the airline, a powerful man whose decisions could end careers with a single phone call. The color drained from Danielle's face. Fear, real, undeniable fear, began to take root. But first-class passengers, unaware of what had just happened over the intercom, continued their quiet conversations. A few still glanced at Eloise, curious about how the situation would unfold. Standing at the back of the cabin, Emily Reed noticed the shift immediately. She saw the change in Danielle's expression, saw the way her hands trembled ever so slightly. Eloise, however, remained perfectly still. She hadn't moved an inch. But there was something in her eyes, a depth, a quiet certainty, that made it clear she knew exactly what was happening. Danielle swallowed hard. She blinked rapidly, struggling to steady herself. "It appears that," she started, her voice faltering before she quickly corrected herself. "It appears there was no mistake. I'll return shortly." She set the intercom down, her fingers unsteady. For a fleeting second, Danielle wanted to run, wanted to do anything to avoid what was about to happen. But she couldn't, because whether she liked it or not, this was only the beginning. She stood frozen for a moment, gripping the edge of the intercom panel. Her pulse pounded in her ears like a relentless drumbeat, warning her, screaming at her, that she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. But she couldn't afford to show fear. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her posture and turned back toward first class, forcing herself to walk with purpose. But something had changed. She could feel it in the air. The moment she stepped back into the cabin, all eyes were on her. Some passengers still pretended not to be paying attention, but others, those who were familiar with the airline industry, had already started piecing things together. Danielle kept moving, her confidence slipping, but still clinging to what professionalism she had left. She headed straight for Eloise Gardner, and for the first time, she wasn't sure what she was going to say. Danielle forced a tight smile, her confidence wavering but not yet broken. "It seems I made a small mistake, Mrs. Gardner," she said, her voice attempting to sound light. "I apologize for the inconvenience." Eloise slowly looked up at her. Her eyes were sharp, but there was no anger in them. "Mistake?" she asked, her tone calm, almost curious. Danielle nodded quickly. "Yes, just a minor system error." Eloise studied her, her gaze steady and unreadable. "That's strange," she said smoothly, "because I don't recall seeing you check the system." Silence. A few passengers took in a sharp breath, sensing that this was no longer just an ordinary seating dispute. Emily, still standing nearby, felt a shift in the air, a tension so heavy it was almost suffocating. Danielle opened her mouth to respond, but Eloise lifted a single finger, cutting her off effortlessly. "Do you know what matters most to an airline?" Eloise asked. Her voice was not raised, but each word carried a weight that pressed into the cabin like a quiet storm rolling in. Danielle didn't answer. Eloise smiled, but there was something dangerous hidden beneath it. Reputation. One word. But it echoed through the cabin, louder than the hum of the engines. A man sitting nearby gave a slight nod of agreement. Others shifted in their seats, fully engaged now, realizing that this was no longer just a misunderstanding. Danielle fought to keep her composure. But deep down, she knew she had pushed too far. And then, a voice came through the intercom. Deeper. Colder. Final. Miss Calloway. Danielle froze. This was not a warning. This was a directive. The tension in the first-class cabin was suffocating now. The steady hum of the plane's engine felt distant, drowned out by the sheer weight of the moment. Danielle felt the cold sweat trickle down her back. She knew that every word, every move she made from this point on would determine her fate. But instead of backing down, instead of accepting what was coming, she clung desperately to whatever power she had left. She turned back to Eloise, her voice strained but still trying to sound professional. "Mrs. Gardner, I'm going to have to ask you to cooperate," Danielle said, her hands tightening around the fabric of her uniform as if holding on to control itself. Eloise raised an eyebrow, watching her with an almost amused expression, as if observing a child trying to argue their way out of trouble. "Cooperate," she repeated, her voice soft but with an unmistakable edge. Danielle took a deep breath. She knew she was losing control, but she couldn't stop herself. "You still need to vacate this seat," she declared, her voice firmer now. A few passengers gasped. The audacity, the sheer nerve of this flight attendant. Emily, completely shocked beyond words, took a quick step forward. "Danielle, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice urgent, almost pleading. Danielle ignored her. She had backed herself into a corner, and now the only way out was to push forward, before she was pushed out herself. So she reached down, gripping Eloise's arm to pull her up. And in that instant, she made the worst mistake of her life. The slap landed fast and hard. A sharp, piercing crack shattered the heavy silence. First class fell into absolute shock. Every head turned, a few passengers gasped aloud. Others, their mouths slightly agape, fumbled for their phones. Emily was completely frozen. Eloise slowly turned back from the impact, but she did not raise her voice. She did not lash out. Instead, she simply looked at Danielle, with disappointment, deep, heavy, unshakable. And somehow, that was worse than anger. Much, much worse. Because in that moment, Danielle knew. She had gone too far. But the worst part? This wasn't over yet. Eloise quietly picked up her phone, and with just one message, the real storm began. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. She simply unlocked her phone, calm and deliberate. No one in first class moved. Some passengers were still in disbelief, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. A flight attendant, a uniformed authority figure, had slapped an elderly passenger right in front of them. Emily stood completely still, stunned beyond words. She couldn't believe what Danielle had just done. Danielle, on the other hand, was frozen in a strange mix of shock and defensiveness. She looked down at her own hand, as if she couldn't quite believe what she had just done either. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Eloise typed a short message. Sent. Just one tap on the screen. No one knew what she had written. No one knew who she had contacted. But somehow everyone felt it. This wasn't just a text. This was the beginning of the end. And the silence in the cabin, the sheer weight of it, was more terrifying than any raised voices could have been. Danielle swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay composed. She turned to Emily, her voice unsteady. "Call security," she said. Emily's eyes widened in disbelief. You just hit a passenger, and now you want security?" Danielle didn't care about logic anymore. She only wanted to regain control. But then, a voice crackled over the intercom. Slow, calm, but filled with undeniable authority. "This is Charles Gardner. I want to know what just happened to my wife." No one breathed. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She turned to Eloise and saw that she was still sitting there, calm, as if she had expected this all along. Danielle, meanwhile, stood frozen in place. It felt like the blood had drained from her body. The realization hit her. All at once, like a punch to the gut. The nightmare was only just beginning. Every single eye in the first-class cabin was now locked onto her. No one questioned what was happening anymore. No one thought this was just a simple misunderstanding. A passenger slowly raised their phone, but Danielle was too panicked to notice. Her hands began to tremble. She wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The air in the cabin felt heavy, suffocating. And then, the voice came through the intercom again, colder, sharper. "Miss Calloway, would you like to repeat what you just did to my wife?" Danielle couldn't answer, because she knew, no matter what she said now, there was no saving herself. The intercom remained open, but no one in first class spoke. Danielle stood still, her heartbeat so loud it echoed in her own ears. That name. Charles Gardner. The name that everyone in the airline industry knew, the man who held more power than anyone else in this company. With just one decision, he could elevate or destroy someone's entire career. And now, his voice, cold and unyielding, was aimed directly at her. A few passengers leaned toward each other, whispering hurriedly. They understood. This situation was far worse than anyone had initially thought. Emily felt a deep unease settle in her chest. She had never seen a flight go off the rails like this. Danielle swallowed, desperately searching for her voice. But her throat was dry. She had no idea what to say. "Can you hear me, Miss Calloway?" The voice over the intercom came again, colder this time. Sharper. Danielle flinched, her mouth opening, but no words came out. There was nowhere left to run, no way to deny what had just happened. Passengers were staring at her. Some had their phones raised now, likely recording. Everything was turning against her faster than she could control. She took a deep breath, desperately trying to steady her voice. "Mr. Gardner?" She began, but her voice wavered. She tried to sound professional. Tried to pretend this was just a simple misunderstanding. "I believe there was a slight miscommunication with your wife," she said quickly. "I absolutely did not mean. You slapped her." Charles Gardner's voice cut through her excuses like a blade. Each word was razor-sharp, cold, and absolute. Danielle went rigid. It felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the cabin. She turned to Eloise, hoping, praying she would say something, anything to help her. But Mrs. Gardner just sat there, hands resting on her lap, making no effort to intervene. And that was even more terrifying than anger. Emily, standing frozen nearby, felt a chill creep up her spine. She was starting to realize something. Danielle swallowed hard, speaking faster now. "Mr. Gardner, I believe we can discuss this after we land." "No." Charles cut her off immediately. "We're going to discuss it right now." A deadly silence filled the first-class cabin. A few passengers gasped quietly, some even covering their mouths as they realized this was far beyond a simple confrontation. Danielle felt fear clamp down on her, tightening around her chest like a vice. But she couldn't back down now. She glanced around, searching for someone, anyone who might support her. But no one spoke up. Not a single person. She was completely alone. And then, Charles Gardner's voice came again, this time lower, quieter. "Miss Calloway," he said slowly, "you are hereby suspended, effective immediately." The words hit like a hammer. Danielle's breath caught, her heartbeat staggering. She tried to remain calm, but her hands began to shake. Because those weren't just words, that was a verdict. Everything she had once believed made her powerful, her authority, her control, her position, gone. Danielle felt a cold sweat drip down her spine. She wanted to fight back, to hold on to the last shred of power she had left. But then, Eloise Gardner moved. Not much, just a small, simple gesture. She gently folded the handkerchief in her hands, smoothing out the fabric. And that was it. No words. But in the silence, the message was clear. Danielle had lost. And the worst part? This was only the beginning. The soft static of the intercom faded, but the weight of Charles Gardner's words still echoed in Danielle's mind. "You are suspended, immediately." She could barely process it. Everything was slipping out of her control too fast. The energy in the cabin shifted, from curiosity to utter shock. Some passengers remained silent, while others fully grasped that they were witnessing a moment that would not be forgotten. Danielle felt like the floor of the aircraft was tilting beneath her. She stood frozen, her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She took a shaky breath, clinging to the last thread of hope. "Mr. Gardner," she said, trying to keep her voice as smooth as possible, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I can explain." But before she could finish, another voice rang out. This time, not over the intercom, but right in front of her. "Captain Pierce." "Miss Calloway," he said, his tone firm yet composed. "Come with me. Now." A dead silence filled the first-class cabin. Everything was worse than Danielle had imagined. Her eyes widened as she turned to the captain, then darted around the cabin as if searching for an escape. Emily stood nearby, her face pale with disbelief. She couldn't believe this was unfolding in front of her. Danielle felt her breathing quicken. I don't think this is as serious as," she began, forcing a nervous smile. I just wanted to ensure the right seat was. No. The single cold word from Charles Gardner cut through her like ice. You weren't ensuring anything, Miss Calloway, he said, his voice so calm that it was terrifying. You wanted to assert your power, and you made a mistake that cannot be undone. The entire cabin froze. Some passengers exchanged glances. Others looked toward Eloise, who had remained composed from the very beginning. Danielle felt a deep chill seep into her bones. This couldn't be happening. Sir, I can apologize, she tried desperately. I truly. Captain Pierce cut her off. Miss Calloway, you are no longer the lead flight attendant on this flight. His voice was now unwavering, absolute. The entire cabin fell into stunned silence. Danielle had never heard those words spoken to her before. Years of serving on high-profile flights, catering to VIPs, erased in mere minutes. She looked around again, praying that someone would stand up for her. But no one did. Not one flight attendant, not one passenger. Everyone had seen the truth. Eloise simply adjusted the shawl draped over her shoulders, her expression unchanged. Danielle felt a burning sensation rise in her throat. She wanted to fight back, argue, turn the situation around. But before she could speak, Captain Pierce delivered the final order. You will collect your personal belongings and relocate to the crew jump seat. Danielle stood motionless, stunned. This was the greatest humiliation a flight attendant could face. From a position of authority, she had just been demoted in front of an entire cabin of witnesses. The whispers began. Some passengers gawked in disbelief. Others didn't even try to hide their satisfaction. Danielle finally realized the worst part of all. It wasn't just that she had been suspended. It wasn't just that she had lost her authority on this flight. It was that she was being publicly stripped of power before dozens of witnesses. And this moment, this humiliation, would never disappear. She had lost everything, right in front of everyone. But the thing that truly terrified her? This still wasn't the end. Danielle walked down the narrow aisle of first class, each step heavier than the last, as if she were dragging the wreckage of her career behind her. No one spoke. But the stares weighed down on her. Shock, disdain, even quiet satisfaction. Yet not a single person moved to help. Step by step, she felt like she was walking across a floor made of razor blades. Each stare, a fresh cut. By the time she reached the back, her entire body had gone cold. Her hands trembled as she unlocked the crew compartment to retrieve her personal bag. She had to do something. She couldn't let this be the end. Heart pounding, she pulled out her phone, scrolling quickly through her contacts. Someone. Anyone. Someone who could pull her out of this nightmare. Finally, her finger stopped on a familiar name, a former HR director she had once worked with. She hit dial, her breath quick and uneven. Ringing. 1 second. 2 seconds. Then, a click. Someone answered. Danielle didn't waste a second. Hello, this is Danielle. I'm in a situation. I need your help. Danielle? The voice on the other end was hesitant. Yes, please, I need. A long sigh. And then, the words that made her stomach drop. I can't help you. Danielle froze. What? She whispered as if she couldn't comprehend what she had just heard. I already heard about what happened on that flight, he admitted, his voice quiet. And honestly, I don't want to be involved. Danielle's breath caught in her throat. You don't understand. It was a misunderstanding. If I can just talk to someone. I'm sorry, he said quickly. But that was Charles Gardner's wife. You have no way out of this. Her jaw fell open, like someone had punched the air out of her lungs. Wait, please, just listen to me. I can explain. If I could just talk to someone. Beep, beep, beep. The line went dead. Danielle stared at her phone, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She tried calling back. No answer. She tried another contact, a former colleague, someone from the company, but no one picked up. She tried again, and again, and again. Nothing. A cold sweat trickled down her spine. She felt like she was suffocating. She had been cut off. This wasn't just a suspension. She had been erased. Danielle gripped her phone tightly, her nails digging into her palm. No, this couldn't be happening. She couldn't lose everything over one mistake. She had to fix this. She had to do something. Right now. And there was only one person who could save her now. Eloise Gardner. Danielle took a deep breath, forcing herself to summon whatever confidence she had left. She had no other choice. She had to go back to first class. She had to face Eloise Gardner. She had to beg. Her steps were quick, desperate, Nothing like the woman who had once walked these aisles with arrogance. Passengers watched her with curious eyes, wondering what she could possibly do now. She stopped beside seat 1B, where Eloise Gardner still sat. The elderly woman did not immediately look up. She simply turned a page in the small book resting in her hands, unbothered, as if she had all the time in the world. Danielle swallowed hard, then spoke, her voice hoarse. "Mrs. Gardner." Slowly, Eloise lifted her gaze. Her expression was calm, steady, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. Danielle felt the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders, but she had no other choice. She lowered her voice almost a whisper. I want to apologize." Eloise didn't respond immediately. She simply studied Danielle for a long moment, as if considering something. Then, she spoke, slowly, deliberately. "You apologize," she said, her voice even. "But for what?" Danielle pressed her lips together, struggling to hold back the fear tightening around her. Because I was wrong." Her voice wavered. "I shouldn't have treated you that way. I shouldn't have acted like that." Eloise tilted her head slightly, her gaze unchanging. "You regret your actions," she said softly. "Or do you regret getting caught?" A simple question. Yet it cut straight to the core of Danielle. Her lips pressed together, her entire body frozen. She knew the right answer, but she also knew that if she lied, Eloise would see right through her. She took a shaky breath, then whispered, "Both." Eloise's expression remained unchanged, but something in her gaze made it hard for Danielle to breathe. Finally, Eloise gave a slow nod. "Good," she said. "Then I hope you remember this." She closed her book, placing it neatly on the small table in front of her. Danielle felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Mrs. Gardner would speak to Charles on her behalf. Maybe there was still a chance. But then, Eloise's fingers gently tapped her phone screen, as if sending one final message. And in that instant, Danielle's hands went ice cold. She realized something crucial. Eloise Gardner was not the one who controlled her fate. Charles Gardner was, and he was waiting for her on the ground. The air inside first class felt heavier than ever. Danielle stood motionless beside Eloise's seat, her mind completely blank. She had just clung to the tiniest sliver of hope that her late apology might save her. But in a single moment, when Eloise sent that last message, she knew it was over. Every pair of eyes in first class was now locked onto her. Some were curious, some were satisfied, others were simply waiting to see what would happen next. But even they couldn't predict what was coming. A soft ding echoed from the plane's intercom system. Then, Captain Pierce's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for landing. Cabin crew, take your positions." Danielle's stomach twisted painfully. The moment had arrived. She could already picture what was waiting for her the second the plane touched the ground. She glanced at Eloise, hoping she might say something, might help her. But Mrs. Gardner simply turned away, gazing out the window, as if this entire situation had never been of any concern to her. Emily, who had witnessed everything from the beginning, leaned in and whispered softly, "Danielle, do you realize how serious this is?" Danielle's fists clenched, but she didn't answer. She didn't want to know. She wanted to believe that somehow she could escape this. But then, a message flashed across the small crew monitor. Requesting security team and airline executives at arrival gate, orders from Charles Gardner. Emily read the message, then slowly turned to look at Danielle. Danielle's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen a message like that before. She had never been summoned directly upon landing. Some of the other flight attendants had seen it too. The tension in their eyes said everything. No one spoke, because they all understood. This wasn't just a disciplinary action. This was a sentence. A moment of hopeless waiting. Danielle sat in the crew jump seat, cold sweat beading on her skin. She could feel it, the quiet contempt from the crew around her. No one spoke to her. No one reassured her. They all knew. She was no longer one of them. The plane shuddered as it touched the ground, the wheels screeching softly against the runway. Danielle shut her eyes, holding her breath, praying this was just a nightmare. But when she opened them, the nightmare was still there. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. The aircraft has landed successfully. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off." And at that moment, a cold chill ran down her spine. Danielle lifted her gaze toward the front of the cabin, and her stomach dropped. Because right there, standing just outside the jet bridge, was Charles Gardner. The moment of reckoning, passengers stood up, gathering their bags, but the air inside the cabin felt different, tense, unnatural. Some pretended not to look, but they were watching, waiting. Danielle did not move. Her body felt paralyzed. Through the small window of the plane door, she could see Charles Gardner standing with a group of men in black suits, the airline's senior executives, and right beside him, 2 uniformed security officers. Emily took a shaky breath. "Oh my God," she whispered. Danielle already knew. She didn't need anyone to tell her. She was about to be escorted off the plane in front of everyone. There would be no second chances, no explanations, no way back. Everything was over. A fate already decided. The new lead flight attendant, who had replaced Danielle, stepped toward the front, doing the final checks before opening the door. "Cabin crew, prepare for passenger disembarkation." A sharp click echoed through the cabin as the plane door unlocked, and passengers began filing out. But no one rushed to leave. They were waiting. They wanted to see what was about to happen, and they wouldn't have to wait long. One of the security officers stepped onto the plane. He didn't have to ask any questions. His eyes found Danielle immediately, and in that moment, Danielle knew there was nothing left to say. Taking one last slow breath, she forced herself to stand. Her legs felt like lead, but she knew there was no running from this. She had to walk through first class, had to pass by Eloise Gardner. And as she did, Mrs. Gardner did not say a word. She simply gave her a look, a quiet, knowing look. And somehow, that was worse than anything she could have said, a look that would haunt her forever. Danielle felt her face burning, but there was nothing she could do. There was no one left on her side. No one cared about her anymore. And as she stepped through the plane door, escorted past the watchful eyes of passengers, she realized the most painful truth of her life. She had lost everything. Not just her job, not just her career, but herself. Danielle walked through the jet bridge, each step heavy as stone. The airport lights cast long shadows on the ground before her, shadows that stretched endlessly, just like her fate now, uncertain, with no way out. Up ahead, Charles Gardner stood waiting. He didn't have to say a word. His presence alone was enough for everyone to understand. This was not a disciplinary meeting. This was a sentencing. Danielle's steps trembled, but she tried to keep her posture composed, tried to pretend she still had control. But she wasn't fooling anyone. Passengers passing by stole glances at her, some whispering among themselves, others looking directly at Charles Gardner, waiting for what would happen next. Emily followed a few steps behind, worry flickering on her face. But even Emily knew there was nothing she could do now. Danielle took a deep breath, forcing herself to face Charles Gardner. But he barely spared her a glance. Instead, he turned to the man in the dark suit beside him. "Take her to the administrative office." 4 simple words, but they shattered Danielle completely. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, to beg. But she knew, from this moment on, there was nothing left for her to hold on to. No authority, no colleagues, no dignity, only judgment. The final verdict. The airline's administrative office was spacious, but to Danielle, it felt like an interrogation room. On the table sat a tablet. Her file was already pulled up. The words, "suspended pending termination," were displayed clearly across the screen. But she knew this was not just a simple suspension. Because Charles Gardner was sitting across from her. Eloise Gardner wasn't in the room, but she didn't have to be. Her name alone was the reason Danielle was sitting here right now. Charles slowly removed his glasses, placed them on the table, and looked at Danielle with a stare so sharp it felt like a blade. "So," he said, voice calm but cutting, "I assume you understand why you're here." Danielle bit her lip, then nodded. I made a mistake." Charles tilted his head slightly. A mocking smirk, but it wasn't amusement. "A mistake?" he repeated. "I don't think that word is strong enough to describe what you did today." Danielle felt a chill run through her. "Sir, she swallowed, forcing the words out. "I truly regret it." Charles didn't blink. "Regret?" He repeated the word slowly, deliberately. Then he leaned forward slightly. "Do you regret doing it? Or do you regret getting caught?" That question again. And Danielle knew. This time there was no escaping it. The question Eloise had asked her on the plane. The question Danielle couldn't answer honestly. She took a shaky breath, then lowered her head. Both. Charles didn't react immediately. He simply studied her for a long moment, as if weighing something in his mind. Then he turned the tablet screen toward her. Do you know what happens when a flight attendant engages in unacceptable behavior? Danielle looked down at the screen, her eyes widening in shock. Her record had been permanently marked with a single chilling sentence. Employment terminated, not eligible for hire at any affiliated airline. Every ounce of strength drained from her body. She wasn't just fired, she was banned from the airline industry forever. Every door in her career had just slammed shut. She opened her mouth, wanting to say something, anything, but no words came out. Charles simply nodded, as if confirming the finality of her fate. This is the consequence of believing you had the right to decide who deserved respect, he said. Danielle couldn't argue, because deep down, he was right. Walking away from everything. 40 minutes later, Danielle stood outside the airport. Alone. No colleagues, no job, no status, no one to call for help. Everything she had once believed she would always have, gone in a single afternoon. She looked around, watching as the world kept moving. People still rushed to catch flights, still laughed, still lived, still moved forward. Only she had been left behind. She reached for her phone, thinking of calling someone. But then she realized a terrifying truth. Her contact list was worthless. There was no one left who could help her. She had been erased. Completely. A cold wind swept through the airport entrance, but this time, it wasn't the weather that chilled her. It was the realization of what she had lost. It was the understanding that she had nowhere left to turn. She had once thought she was untouchable, but now, she was just another forgotten face in a sea of strangers. She had disappeared, without a sound, without a goodbye, without anyone caring, and that was the most painful punishment of all. Danielle sat quietly on a bench near the airport exit, gripping her handbag as if it was the only thing left in her life. The world kept turning, but for her, it had completely stopped. Passengers hurried past, dragging their heavy suitcases behind them. Flight attendants, dressed in their crisp uniforms, strode purposefully toward their gates, ready for the next flight. Only she was stuck in the terrible silence of her own making. She thought about taking out her phone, calling someone, texting someone, but then she remembered. No one would answer. The people who once respected her now saw her as nothing more than a name in the past. The people who once feared her now had no reason to care. No one was calling. No one was looking for her. No one cared where she would go or what she would do next. Everything she had, everything had vanished because of one moment of arrogance. She had believed power gave her strength, but in the end, true strength lies in how a person treats others, and she had made the wrong choice. A cool afternoon breeze swept through the airport, empty and cold. Danielle stood up, slung her bag over her shoulder, and walked toward a place where no one knew her anymore. For the first time in her life, she truly felt small. No more expecting glances, no one to command, no one to fear her. Just empty space. And she had no idea where to go next. The lesson that remains. The story has ended, but the lesson from it still lingers. One action, driven by arrogance, prejudice, or even a momentary lapse in judgment, can destroy an entire life. Danielle didn't lose everything because of a slap. She lost everything because of how she treated others. She thought she had the right to decide who deserved respect and who didn't. But in the end, power doesn't belong to those who give orders. It belongs to those who treat others with respect, kindness, and humility. Danielle's story serves as a reminder to all of us. The way we act today, the way we treat others, will shape our own future. What do you think about Danielle's fate? Did she deserve this ending? Or could she have done something different to change her path? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy emotional, thought-provoking stories like this one, make sure to hit like and subscribe to Aiva Stories today. Share this story with your friends and family, because you never know who might need this lesson. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.